I've finally reached a sense of authenticity with somebody, but like, what happens if this person gets into a position of leadership and then all of a sudden they go, 10 years ago, Dan said this to me. And, it was really, at the time I was like, we were buddy, but now that as I have grown or matured or changed or whatever, I don't think I want that in my pastor. I don't think we need that for our pastor. Like, our pastor shouldn't be that way.
My name is Timothy Eldred. On today's episode, I am talking with Pastor Dan Boal. Dan and I have been friends for a few years now, and during that time, I have learned to appreciate his ability to say what no one else in the room is willing to say, even though that is exactly what everyone is thinking. So nothing in our conversation today shocked me. It was very refreshing, and I know you'll find it to be as well. Welcome. This is the Authentic Pastor Podcast. This set is, I think it looks dark. People think it looks warm, but I do think it accentuates, my skin tone. So
Yeah, you're not wrong. Yeah, I think the dark woody background and the guitars and the banjo, it really sets off this,
and it
distinguished
makes it look like
gentleman.
I got some musical ability or something,
Yeah, like you can sing a song and pick some chords, which I've heard you sing. You're pretty good. I
I
mean,
can sing a
I'd
song and
definitely, I'd
pick
worship
some
with you.
chords. I can't play that banjo if my life depended on it. Matter of fact,
That's
I've
just a
got a
showpiece.
ukulele that hangs in the office, and Kelton stole that because he knows I don't play it. So he's going to try to learn a little, somewhere over the rainbow ditty on the ukulele. Man,
I got to
hey,
tell you, I'm a little jealous. I have no musical ability at all, like zero, none.
it's all right. You've got a radio, you've got
That's
YouTube,
true. I know.
Spotify.
Got all the other things.
There's a lot of people out there without musical ability that make a living. They lead worship in church. Sounds like someone backed over a cattle truck, but like any
Yeah.
good, high school youth ministry worship band,
Yep.
just turn it
Yeah.
up,
Well,
play louder.
anybody who picked up a guitar at 16 to try to impress a girl eventually became a worship pastor, right? I mean,
And they all own the
it's like,
same guitar.
yeah, right.
They own the same guitar that's hanging about behind me, the cheapest, Taylor
Yeah, right.
314
Yeah.
you can buy. And when you see a person with that guitar, like, you're a worship leader, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you've got to have.
Started at 16,
That's
made that girl
interesting.
swoon.
That's an interesting that's an interesting conversation, believe it or not, of what we're talking just about a little bit, is people who live under the imposter syndrome, and people who don't feel qualified or competent, and some aren't, and but
Well, many aren't.
they're doing it anyway. And I mean, not to throw anybody under the bus, but dude, you know as well as I do, there are people out there who love the Lord with all their heart, but someone should have weeded them out of the seminary program.
Well, I think the problem is you had people go into the seminary program in the first place to become pastors when what they really should have done is be mentored and discipled by somebody who actually knows how to be a pastor. Right? I mean, there's a lot of good education. I'm not saying the education is wrong. The education is very good, but it doesn't actually cultivate anything in the heart. And most pastors feel like they're imposters, I think, because they don't actually have a heart for pastoral ministry. They've got the head for preaching. They've got some administrative skills, maybe they don't. I mean, but they got some sort of skill that somebody said you should be in ministry, or maybe they felt a legit call to ministry, but their heart is so wounded that they have no, or just not prepared enough. They just have no real ability to pastor people, shepherd people,
Or they
walk with
thought it
people.
was the only option for them. Like I'll use my
Yeah,
dad, who's
that's true.
83 years old, for an example. My father loves the Lord. He bleeds Jesus, And truthfully, his gift is evangelism. He has the heart of an evangelist. And in the 1970s, someone told him that you should be a pastor.
Mm.
So he sold his business, he packed up his family, he moved and got his formal education, and he has been a successful pastor, but he doesn't really know how to pastor.
Yeah, I understand
He's an
that.
evangelist, and he should have kept his business. He probably would have been more successful, reached more people with the gospel if he would have stayed where he was at. But all of a sudden, it's like, well, I mean, you love Jesus and you really want to do something to help people. You should be a pastor. And
Yeah, when
instead of
I
just recognizing maybe I have a pastoral gift, but that doesn't mean it has to be a profession.
Yeah, just because you have a gift doesn't mean it's a calling. Does that make sense? I think God gives a lot of people different gifts. He doesn't necessarily call them to all the work that that gift may traditionally be established with. But the same thing happened to me as your dad. I mean, I was 17 when I gave my life to Christ. I had no idea what I was supposed to do with that. I mean, I couldn't tell you. I went and I found an army chaplain, believe it or not. He was an army chaplain. I was like, hey, I just gave my life to Jesus. Like, what do I do next? And he actually mapped out for me like 6 steps. He's like, well, first you got to go get baptized. I'm like, all right, I can get baptized. Then after that, you got to start leading inside your church, serving somewhere. I'm like, all right, yeah, I can start doing that too. It's like, then you got to go to Bible college. And I didn't quite understand at the time the jump from like leading in church to like going to Bible college. But again, I didn't know any better. I'm like, all right, I mean, that's 6 months away. So check that box, go to Bible college. Went to Moody Bible Institute. It's like, I'm going to go do this. And then I get there and everybody's like, oh, I'm called to this. I'm called to that. I'm called to this. And like, well, Dan, what are you called to? And I didn't have an answer. I felt really like out of place. I'm like, I'm doing what this army chaplain told me to do. I don't know what I'm called to do. And that was a really frustrating journey because, your majors are specialized, right? Based on like, especially at Moody or maybe other Christian colleges in the ministry departments, pre-seminary, pastoral counseling, youth ministry. I hate all that crap, right? Like, I don't know what to do with any of that. I just felt like I was supposed to follow the Lord and do something. So you end up at Bible college. I was there for 3 years because I hated it so much. I mean, it's a 4-year school, but I hated it so much. I finished in 3 just so I could leave because I had no idea what these people were trying to get me to do. But I knew I didn't want to do any of it. And I had such a penchant really for business and entrepreneurism and everything else. I didn't know where that fit inside the church. And I really feel like that. But yeah, I don't know. It's a whole thing that I still don't know how that fits in the church.
Well, I mean, I think that becomes really difficult. I mean, we've waded into something I'm not sure where to take us. So this is an interesting conversation. Um, it's interesting, especially when you find somebody who may not exactly know where they fit, and now they're pastoring a church, and they're the only one there. They're a solo pastor, which is the majority of all churches,
Yeah, almost
right?
every
There's
every
just
church,
way too just
85%, something
it's
like
it's
that.
it's like 92% of all churches are less than 250. 84% of those are less than 100. Those stats might be a couple years old, but what we know about churches of less than 100 is it's not you, a
One
youth
guy,
pastor, a discipleship pastor. If you're lucky, you might have a part-time volunteer assistant. So you're wearing all the hats and you get into it and go, this is not, this lacks the luster that I thought, because now I'm not pastoring and shepherding and caring for people. I'm mowing the yard. I'm running a church. I'm creating a
shoveling the
budget. I
sidewalk with
know
snow.
nothing about creating a budget. So we've got people out there, God bless them, myself included, for years, who had to create a church budget when I can't balance my checkbook, you know, and present that to a board. And that's where I
Of
think
people, a board of people who, by the way, have no idea how to do that either, for the most
they,
part.
they,
They're
they
like, "Oh yeah,
don't.
looks good, Pastor.
they
Way to
they
go!"
got they got voted into a board position because they went to the bathroom during the congregational meeting, and so that's the
Right.
perfect time to give them a position and vote them in because they can't object to it. But I think that's why a lot of pastors feel a lack of confidence. One of the reasons they feel a lack of confidence, because they're having to take care of duties that may not fit within their giftedness at all. And now
Absolutely.
that can get into a whole nother conversation about the system and structure of the organized church, which I've got to be careful of, because I can throw rocks like anybody can, and that's not what I want to do. I want to build up pastors, not tear down the church. And so, I mean, I could have done a whole podcast on tearing down the church, and we could have all jumped on board, right? And
Tim,
felt
there's too
really
many
good
people
about
already doing
ourselves.
that.
Yeah.
There's too many people already doing that. It's not worth your time to jump on that wagon because
Well, and
everyone else is
it's
already doing it.
it's
It's not
not
edifying. It's not
beneficial.
edifying.
No, it's not. It doesn't. What does that help anybody? So you've got these men and women out there who are serving Christ in a pastoral role, who need to know that I'm okay. Now, some may come to a point in their ministry where they realize that Okay, I've done this for a while and this is not what I want to do. But now go back to this word calling, because I have a little different perspective on it, where people are like, I can't leave pastoral ministry because that's my calling. So they feel like if they walk away from their role or their job or their title, they're walking away from Jesus. And maybe we got that wrong. As opposed
I
to
think
saying
we
you're
absolutely had
called
that
to
wrong.
pastoral ministry, your calling is to Christ, your gifting is a pastor, your placement is a local church. If we can delineate between those three, we can give people freedom to find a different place to serve or a better way to serve within their placement.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. When uh, I guess some background information might be good here. So, before I became the discipleship pastor at the current church in which I'm serving, I was the national youth director for the Christian Missionary Alliance. So, we had, 2,000 churches in the United States, about 50,000 youth. And one of my roles was to travel around and speak and train and equip youth workers and high school students all over the place. And I oftentimes had young people say, I feel called to youth ministry. I feel called to the pastoral ministry. I feel called to the mission field. And I would always challenge that call immediately because they're operating from an immature context. What they're experiencing is the call to be wholeheartedly dedicated to Christ,
Yeah.
and then they're putting a schema over that call that makes sense with their passions, right? Like they're applying that. I think there's sometimes when God makes it very clear to certain people, you will go here and you will do this. I think the majority of people that are serving Christ in pastoral ministry or any kind of ministry of the church, they would tell you, my calling shifts over the years. I felt called to this, then I was called to this, then I was called to this. No, you were never really called to those things. God used you and your gifts and your passions, your skill sets, and put you in those places. But ultimately, first and foremost, if you don't understand you're called to Christ, to have wholehearted obedience to the will of God as you are interpreting it according to the Holy Spirit, what you believe to be the wisdom and counsel of others, then you will find your sense of identity wrapped up in your position, right? You will. Like my identity is the fact that I'm a pastor at a church. Like if I don't preach on Sunday, what am I doing? You know,
But
that's not
that language we use, the vernacular we have chosen is very important, because I grew up hearing that the highest, most holy calling is pastoral ministry. I don't believe that. The
it's a nice line. Sounds
it
good.
sounds
Sounds
really
good when you're
good,
trying to
but when
rally the troops to do
well,
something
when I'm
important.
trying to recruit somebody, and right,
Yeah.
I mean, we're trying to do that now because we're seeing this absence or this exodus of pastors from the church, and people are like concerned, like the pastor is going to be like, and endangered species before
Well,
long.
yeah.
Yeah, and they
There's
may
definitely
be, but
fewer and fewer of them.
I'm not worried about that. If the gates of hell can't prevail against the church, neither can an exodus of pastors, right? And maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing, because then you've got like the priesthood of saints, and people actually would know, because the poor pastor is doing everything. And it's like I said a few years ago, this whole idea that 20% of the people in the church do 80% of the work. I mean, you hear
Yeah.
that floated all the time. We get together at pastors' events or conferences or something, and there's always some kind of grumbling or complaining or bitching that, hey, 20% of the people do 80% of the work. I heard that my entire life. And I come to the conclusion, because I started using that, like, people really love Jesus. They would show up and fold the bulletins, so I didn't have to do that. Thank God we don't use
Yeah. If only
bulletins
they would fold
anymore.
the damn bulletin.
You know, fold your own at least, right? And so what I found out is, it's not, the 20% rule is not because people don't love the Lord and aren't gifted. It's laziness on my part. It's a lack of equipping. It's a lack of training. I mean, my job is not to run an organization, and it's time for us to maybe stand up and go, whoa, whoa, whoa. We can reorganize this cluster that we've created,
Oh
and
yeah, we
a
absolutely
pastor
can.
actually really start spending time. And I'm not saying we don't, but I could spend a whole lot more time with people. There's probably 25 things on my weekly to-do list that I should not be doing. I mean, it is not, in my wheelhouse, but there are people that God has placed within the congregation that I serve who definitely have that gift, who could knock it out in an hour with it may take me 6, if I would just
Yeah.
actually do my one job in Scripture and equip saints for the work of service. Prepare saints for
That is
service
the
and,
one job you're given. Yeah. I
well, I can
mean, you
prepare
have the
saints for
apostles, the
service.
prophets, the evangelists, and what is their role? Is to equip the saints for the good works of God.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
can
without a doubt, that's the role.
if I don't prepare saints for service, it's because I'm busy preparing services for saints. That's my little cliche line, you know.
Ooh, I like that cliche line. You could
Well,
put that
it's
on a poster.
it was so, and it's true.
Put it on those coffee cups.
Oh, so that's why I think we find ourselves compensating for what we feel is an incompetence. That's why I think we walk into situations where we feel like we don't belong. If people really knew, I've got a pastor on
Hmm.
my staff that I literally hired, and people will love this. I literally hired him in a bar, and he was wasted in a bar. Best guitarist I've ever heard. I knew he did not know Jesus for anything. And I said, "Hey, dude, man, you are like lightning on that lead guitar. You ever play in church?" He's like, "Church? I've never hardly
Why would I play there?
been in church." I said, "No, seriously, I'd like you to come to my church." He looked at me like I was stupid. And about 3 weeks later, the guy walks into church. He reeks from the night before. I mean, he's probably still half in the
Yeah,
bag.
I can't imagine he even went to bed. He probably just came walking in.
I mean, he probably gigged till 4 in the morning, right?
Yeah.
Walked into church because I kind of challenged him to. And it was just a few months later, I put him on staff. And now he's on our pastoral team. It's been like 11 years. He's not trained. I haven't sent him to Bible college. I
Sure.
go back to what you said earlier. I've mentored and discipled and equipped him, and he has one of the greatest ministries. Not just because he leads worship, but because as he leads worship, he's still that same guy on the bar. His heart still bleeds through his music. It's just different now. So if you take him to like a youth or a worship pastors conference, man, he feels like an imposter.
I
Like
believe it. Yeah.
what am I
Fish out of
doing
water.
here? And I
Right.
would put him up against anybody, not because of his musical abilities. I mean, that's one thing, but because of his heart for Jesus and his heart for people.
Yeah.
And not that he doesn't need ongoing education, not that he needs some theological understanding and biblical information of how the whole thing flows together and the whole deal. We work on all that over the years. But I do know no matter where I take him, I think he feels as though um, I don't I don't belong here.
Yeah.
And I
I
don't
think
think
that's a
he's
common
alone.
feeling.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I
I
don't
do
think he's
too.
alone either. I think a lot of pastors feel like they don't belong even within their own congregations. Um, this okay. So I've been at this church that I'm at now for about 18 months, and it's the third chair in a mid-sized church, right? So you have the lead pastor, the executive pastor, and then you have me, the discipleship pastor. So I'm the third chair in a church of about 650, 700 people, right? It's not a very big church, not a very small church, but it's third chair. Majority of this church is elderly. I mean, I'd say a good 50% or more are over the age of 55. And I'm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and it's a traditional Brethren church. Okay. So when you walk into that room, people still got suit jackets on, right? Now I got a lot of young staff. We got a lot. I mean, my entire team is younger than I am. I'm 36, and my team is younger than me across the board, in their 20s and early 30s, and they're doing a great job leading the ministries and attracting young families. I love all that stuff. But when I get out there, my very first Sunday here, I showed up in a button down and like a pair of jeans, and I quickly realized these people aren't going to respect me. Like they're not going to listen to me. I mean, half my church is going to just tune me out. That next Sunday, I showed up with a suit jacket. And I keep one. Well, at least I used to keep one behind me here, but I don't have it on this morning. It's Friday. There's nobody here in the building. But every time that I come into work, for the most part, I want to have a suit jacket on if I know I've got people over their 50s coming in, because I live in a culture that is predominantly upper middle class, very old school German Lancaster, and I'm a Philly guy. I don't like. I'm not from this area, and I'm perceived as an outsider. Like without a doubt, I'm perceived as an outsider. I'm not from here. I don't have their heritage. I don't have their values. But the one way I knew I could win, at least initially, is by wearing a suit coat. If you actually go out on our website, you'll see me preaching in a suit jacket. Tim, have you ever seen me in a suit jacket? Ever? Like, think about our time together. ever.
I'm still trying to imagine it, man. I'm just used to flannel, the same worn out boots,
Yes, yeah,
the
dude.
barn
I've been
boots
wearing
that
those boots for like 5 years.
I've seen you in those barn boots, and first met you with really long. When I say really long hair and this big bushy beard, but Dan, that's. But do you feel like an imposter?
Well, I feel like I have to be someone that I'm not for the sake of earning influence. And I hate that. I hate the fact that I can't win the relationship by being me. I've got to be a version of me. It's not that it's not me. I'm a version of me. I'm the suit jacket, clean cut, you can respect me, 35-year-old, make wise decisions, got a great young family, whatever. I've got that version of me, but that's not entirely me. But when I sit down in meetings with people, I mean, I actually, this is just true. And I mean, I changed the cadence of my voice, like I get like pastoral counseling tone. Oh yeah, tell me more about that. Tell me like that's interesting. Oh, I'll pray for you. I'll pray for you, and then we'll pray together or something. But then they leave, and I'm like, geez, that was like, I hate this. I hate the fact that I just did that for an hour, and the person is a good person, but in order to have this is probably a lie that I've come to believe. In order to have the pastoral influence in that person's life, I have to portray the counseling pastor in a suit jacket in that moment. And that's not true, but at the same time, I don't know what the appropriate level of relationship is to necessarily have with these kinds of individuals. So, um, yeah, I mean, I can see there's just, I don't know. So this is like where all my emotions start kicking in. I got to sift through some of the feelings about this, but like, I just, I'll say it now. I absolutely hate sometimes that God has called me to pastoral ministry. I hate it. I hate it more than anything I hate about my entire existence, because so much of my personality and heart and passions and everything else lie outside of the church. And yet I feel this distinct push to bring it into the church, but to bring it into the church requires uh, just absolute torture sometimes. Like, you're going to put yourself out there in front of people, and you're just going to get killed for it. And you're going to try and push people, push people to move in that direction, because you feel like this is where God's trying to take you, and here's how these things work together. Um, and they're ungrateful for it. So it's like they don't want to listen. They don't want to give you authority or influence. They don't want to give you opportunity, and then they're ungrateful for the good things you do. It's like this is the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. Be a pastor.
I am, dude. That you just said that is going to give people who are listening this moment to go, "Holy crap! I thought that was just me." Right?
No,
Yeah, but think about it this way, and this is where I think you have to delineate. I really think it's important in this conversation to say, okay, so my wife's a seventh grade school teacher. There are days that she loves teaching prepubescent seventh grade kids. In other days, she comes home and she's like, pour me a glass of wine and leave me alone. And
got to defrag.
after 35 years, there's still a balance in that. And for the most part, she still teaches because she loves middle level education. But when she comes home, I mean, she used to snap at me. Like, I said, don't snap at me and tell me to sit down or be quiet or whatever. But I mean, sometimes I act like a seventh grader most of the time.
Well, that's true.
That's true. We know that's true. You
That's
know
true.
me. But when she gets up in the morning, she's not a school teacher. She's my wife. She's a mother. She's my friend. She's my lover. She walks out that door. She gets in her car. She drives 30 miles. And when she walks into school, she is Mrs. Eldred. And when she leaves that school at 3:30, she's no longer Mrs. Eldred. And I think pastors have a really difficult time with the idea that I'm pastor 24/7. I'm always pastor.
Right.
Now, there's aspects of my life that are always Tim the pastor. Like, I've never answered to the phrase Pastor Tim in my life. When people in my church go, "This is Pastor Tim," I'm like, I'm Tim. I happen to be the lead pastor of this church, but just let's stick with Tim. When I walk into that building or I walk into an environment, I do put on my pastor hat. And when I walk out, I take it off because I'm working really hard, and this is really not a challenge for me, as I know it's for a lot of people, that my identity does not come from that. And there are times I change my tone and I change my meter, right? And the thing that becomes a challenge is if I can't do that with the level of like this whole project's about and feel like I'm being authentic. If I ever get to the
Right.
point where I feel like, okay, I can't do this anymore because this is not me, I feel like a fraud, then it's probably time for me to relinquish the role and find something different to do. And a couple years ago, I was ready to do that. You know that. I was walking
Yeah. I mean,
out
you're
of
ready to just
ministry.
hang it up,
I
be
was
done.
hanging it up until, you know, until I hired some new staff at church. I've got an amazing team. I've got the best team I've ever had in 30 plus years of pastoral ministry, where I, for the first time, really feel like it's a joy.
Mm,
My job's a joy because and I know a lot of people don't have this privilege, but I get to do only what I'm really good at doing. I get to lead and I get to
yeah.
teach.
That is a privileged position to be in. But you've also were able to get there after 30 some years of doing it. It's not like
Oh
you
yeah,
stepped into it day
right. No, I
one.
didn't,
I mean,
and step
you,
into that. Oh, there are
yeah.
people who think they should step into that right now. You know.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I shouldn't have to do this. I should be here wherever. I will say you keep talking about the word, feeling like a fraud. I I think there's different levels or different stages of life in which your experience of feeling like an imposter changes. I remember when I first got in ministry, I felt like I don't actually have the skills for this, right? To do the organization, to do the speaking, do whatever. And I feel like everybody's going to know I'm 22 and unprepared, right? And so you feel like a fraud in some senses until you do it for 5 or 6 years. You're like, oh, I no longer see myself as somebody who's trying to become a pastor. I guess I really am a pastor at this point because I have a skill set and I have a ways of doing this that are really good. And then it transitions to I think I'm a fraud because I'm doing what I don't want to do. Right, I'm doing what like it doesn't align with actually how I've been made or called or crafted, and then that's kind of like that career crisis, right? Where everybody I've talked to in their 30s is like, well, what am I going to do in this second phase? I got to find a job that really aligns with who I am and how God's made me. But then you kind of get into this other place where it's the loneliness. I think like I'm starting to kind of come into that phase. Maybe I'm leaving. Like I understand who I am in my job and career and everything else, and who I am in Christ. I get that all that, but now I'm actually more in this lonely phase of. Uh, it's just really, really hard. Just really hard to share the fullness of your life with people in your church. You like it's just really tough. Like so, you talk about Pastor Dan versus Dan who lives on the street. I got a house and I got neighbors, and my dynamic with my neighbors is fundamentally more authentic in
Mm.
terms of who I present myself as than to most of the people in my church. Now, I'm not saying I don't have pockets. I've got little pockets of people that I really just have started to trust and opened up to. But that comes with time. It takes a lot of time to get that for me. I don't know. Maybe it's not true for everybody else. It takes a lot of time to come to a place where I can finally just say what's on my mind and on my heart and like have these people not only, value it, but appreciate it and be able to pastor me back, right? Minister to me in that space as well. And yet I still feel like I'm leaving this back door open for something to come bite me in the back 10 years from now. Right. Like I finally reached a sense of authenticity with somebody, but what happens if this person gets into a position of leadership and then all of a sudden they go, 10 years ago, Dan said this to me. And, it was really at the time I was like, we were buddy buddy, but now that as I have grown or matured or changed or whatever, I don't think I want that in my pastor. I don't think we need that for our pastor. Like our pastor shouldn't be that way. And how does
I've
that
got
come
I've
back?
I've got a whole list of things you've said over the years that I'm waiting to pull out, to bury
Yeah,
to
I
bury
know,
you
man.
with.
I know. That's why we don't work together on a regular basis. Because if we did, I'm sure the building would burn down. I just, I say so many things, and this is the other thing too. Is like when you're somebody, and maybe I'm not talking a lot on this podcast, but when you're somebody who talks a lot and has big ideas, you don't always think through the ramification of those ideas. You just say them out loud, right? Or you have a thought, so you say it. You don't really mean it. You don't really want it to come into fruition. You're not really trying to make that a reality for your church or for somebody else, but uh, it's what you thought, right? And that thought's going to come back and
I don't
hang
think
you
this
one
is
day.
I don't think this is new in human nature at all, but it
Sure.
is certainly it's certainly been risen to the forefront with social media, with politics, with the gotcha culture, with the cancel culture. And it's awfully hard not to think about, even in the church, because the church, unfortunately, is more influenced by culture than influences the culture.
Oh,
And so
absolutely.
you know that, man, there's something I said. I mean, authenticity, I like to say that authenticity, being authentic, means you never have to have a memory. Like, what did I say?
Sure, because
But
you're going to
that's only on
believe
me.
you.
Only right. I don't know what you're going to do with what I said or how I behaved or if I had a moment of weakness or just a moment of honesty. So authentic means I don't have to look over my shoulder and wonder who's watching. And but the reality is that sounds really good. That's a nice, really good definition, but I do have to look over my shoulder. I can't
Yeah,
be
because sin is in the
completely
world.
100% me with everybody. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm duplicitous. Maybe it just means I'm discerning.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you can definitely be discerning. One of the things I did a lot of research on about 12 years ago was what we call appropriate self disclosure, right? And this was like right when social media was blowing up and everybody started putting everything about themselves on social media. And people still do put everything about themselves on social media, at least the parts they want you to see. And
The
there's
filtered fun part of me,
the
right?
the filtered aspect, right? And that's okay, that's okay. The filtered, the appropriate self disclosure is an actual competency. It's what we call a communication competency. You need to be competent in what you disclose, how you disclose it, and when you disclose it. Especially in the area of, let's talk about sales, for example. That's a big one. Business mergers, for there's all kinds of privatized information that you can't just disclose 100% right away. But when it comes to the self, like the actual life of the self and your soul, the only safe place, the only place I feel like I can 1,000% disclose everything inside my heart is to the Lord, right? I mean, that's it. Like that's the only place because I don't feel like He's going to come back and get me with those things. It's like I don't got to be like, Lord, I really love to sell my church building and go buy one, go build a brand new one across the street because this building is absolutely terrible. By the way, Grace Church, our building is terrible. It is like it was built to be a school, not to be a church. I would love for this thing to burn to the ground, and I don't want to raise millions of dollars to fix it. Like we should sell it, buy a building across the street, and life would be a lot easier.
I'm
And I
gonna
just
do a
said that
little.
out loud.
I'm gonna do a sound bite. I'm gonna have a producer do a little sound bite, cut that out of there, and we're gonna send that to you.
Yeah, you send that out, because it does it like I feel that way. I feel safe telling that to the Lord. I don't feel safe telling that to this church because these people they built this church. They raised
Well,
the money. They
you
put
know
on
why?
the.
One of the reasons why it's safe telling it to the Lord is you didn't shock him in the first place.
No, he already knows.
He
He's
already
aware.
knows. There's a lot of people who can't tell that to the Lord because they can't tell that to themselves, right? They think they're like
Right.
ashamed that they would actually have that thought because that's guilt and condemnation for actually having a thought even about the church being burned to the ground, let alone myself, my
Right.
issues, my weaknesses. So if you can't do you, it's hard to have appropriate disclosure when you can't have self-disclosure.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. And you
Yeah.
can't really self-disclose unless you're aware of yourself. So
Yeah.
self-awareness and self-disclosure go hand in hand,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
The more your self-awareness rises, the more you can disclose appropriately or at least use language that articulates, how you're
So,
really
so
feeling about
what
things.
have you learned in that study about like steps or principles that can be applied that you applied? Like, what's the boundary? Where's too much is too much?
So, I guess it's a little bit of a formula, really, but it comes down to this, which is the greater level of your relationship, the more self-disclosure it can handle, right? The more
Mm-hmm.
truth it can handle.
Mm-hmm.
So so if I was going to put it in like Christiany terms, I guess is like the more love you have between you and another individual, the greater the love there, where they feel it, you feel it. The higher the trust, the more self-disclosure it can actually bear. The weight of that relationship can bear the disclosure. And so that's one of those things that I think is really important. So when you think about like just a pragmatic aspect, let's talk about preaching, for example. My father's from a generation of preachers that was told to never use a story about himself. Like when he went to seminary, they trained him. All your illustrations, all your examples need to be third parties. They can't be personal because if they're personal, you open yourself up to criticism, and that criticism opens you up to ineffective leadership. right? That was like that's I mean he's if you hear him preach, he opens up with a joke almost every sermon. His illustrations are all stories of historical events or something else, and they're all very good. He's a great preacher. I'm not saying he's a really good communicator, but all that stuff is nothing about himself. Zero, right? Zero about himself. I hear younger pastors, in their 20s and 30s, when they preach, they can't stop talking about themselves, right? Everything is about me. Well, I was driving down the street and I saw this guy pull up to me in a car next to me, and I really loved his car, and that was envy. All right. And so, okay. So now what happens is you get what you feels like is a self-focused pastor, somebody who can only preach in light of their own experience. And that is not really good either, because a competency, communication competency, is what we call relatable experiences, things that help build the shared experience. So there is this line, at least in the art of preaching, that requires a sense of appropriate self-disclosure and a mix of outside influences to help people grasp and understand the truth and the context of God's word. But I think the same thing is true in our personal relationships, right? I mean, like that, there has to be a sense of legitimate, love and trust and opportunity to share yourself appropriately so that people have a commonality with you where they begin to love you and trust you and appreciate you. It's like with a kid. Let's talk about kids coming out of the closet for a minute, right? I've had so many teenagers come out of the closet to me before they ever came out to their parents. And I ask myself that question because the level of love that I have for that teenager is a whole lot less than the level of love that their parents have for them.
Of course.
I mean, I believe that to be true.
Sure.
And but for whatever reason, the parent and the child haven't cultivated a strong enough relationship of shared experiences where there was enough trust built where a child could come out and disclose that information. But as a youth pastor, when I was youth pastor, I spent so much time building shared experiences, shared common experiences, that there's such a higher level of trust, even if the level of love isn't necessarily there. So whenever I think about this idea of the authentic pastor, for me, it is at what point in time do I reach a level of shared experience with somebody where I love them and trust them enough I can begin to disclose more and more of who I am in a place where I trust what they know. And for Tim, you and I mean, we have been in experiences that uh, really catalyze the love and the trust and the shared experience. Right. I mean, we have been on weekend retreats together. We've gone to Israel together for 2 weeks. Like there is just something about our relationship that allows us to be gritty quickly with one another. Because even though I've spent less time with you than most people in my church in the last 18 months, but it's a catalyzing shared experience. I think pastors, and this maybe gets back to what you said earlier, because we're doing the organization of the ministry all the time. We're doing the task to write the sermon, paying the bills, creating the budget, whatever it is. And those are all tasks that make the organization run, but don't build shared experiences with your people. I mean, how many pastors would you say that their shared life experience with their people in their congregation is just from the pulpit? I bet you, I don't know, 90% of pastors, for 90% of pastors, 90% of the people in their church, their primary relationship is from the pulpit,
They don't
right?
know their name, right? Now,
No.
I'm not expecting you in a church of 600, 700 people to know everyone's name. I pastor a church of a couple hundred people. I don't know everyone's name. And I used to feel bad about that. And I'm like, I don't know that I need to know as long as somebody else knows their name. I'm pretty
Right.
happy with that. I mean, until you run into people in my little town of 1,000 people and they're like, hey, really good sermon on Sunday. I'm like, who are you? Right.
Yeah, you were there. Nice. And what's your name again?
But you said something earlier that I made mental note of on this whole idea again of, first of all, the time we spend with people, but you used the word lonely or loneliness earlier. At least I think you did. If not,
I did.
I'm
Yeah.
making it up. And so that becomes a complaint. Like I can't be myself. I don't know who I am. I'm struggling with ministry. And ministry is lonely. Leadership is lonely. The loneliness of leadership, in my estimation, is a self-inflicted myth. If I go to my church building, my office, my study, the pastor's study, it says it on my door, and I
That's a
spend,
Eugene Peterson move.
yeah, if I spend the majority of my time in my study, in my office, apart from people, well, of course I'm going to be lonely. Leadership is lonely. When were we ever gifted to study? Now, is study important? It can be until you spend, 40 hours a week putting together a sermon for a weekend, service. But so let's go back to I don't know who said it. It's a cliche at this point, but people don't care how much you know to how much you care, right?
Right.
It's been
Sure.
said a million times, but it doesn't usually seem to affect what we do. And so now if I get up and I use a personal example on a Sunday morning with people who have no idea who I am because they only see me on an event or a gathering, and it's a quick, like on Sunday morning, I walk out of my study and I walk to the green room and I say a few how do's, but I don't really spend any time with people. And by the time I get off the stage and start walking back out the doors, 99% of people have left the building.
Yeah, sure.
That's really true since COVID. They come at the last minute and they leave immediately.
Out.
There's no lingering, and fellowship, at least not in the church that I serve. And so, yeah, I mean, I do kind of have this sinful pride where I'm not afraid to tell you anything from the pulpit. And my wife will say, "What were you thinking?" And I'm like, she's like,
You
"You
shouldn't have
love,
said that one.
you love to shock people," and I kind of do. It's a weakness of mine, one of like two that I have, and but I think this just goes back to this issue of if I'm going to really build trust with people, I've got to spend time with people. And if I don't spend time with people, then I will always be stuck in this cycle of feeling inauthentic or lonely in leadership. But I control the outcome here. Unless you've got a church, and if you're listening, you have a church that requires office hours, you should quit. If you're a senior pastor that requires office hours of your staff,
You should stop.
you should stop because they're not deadbolt their office door and buy them a backpack and require that they spend 75% of their time face to face with people, because pastoral ministry does not take 40 hours a week sitting in an office all behind yourself. Matter of fact, that's not pastoral ministry. I don't know what that is. That's organizational leadership, but that's not
Oh,
what we're called to do. And yet here
no.
we are sitting in offices having a conversation about not sitting in offices. And that's because we're doing a podcast. I think when you can't call something what it is without the fear of ramifications, and that fear of ramifications keeps you from saying what you really believe, what you really feel, what you really think, what you've really done, that's the ill of inauthenticity that too many pastors deal with. And so they begin to lie to themselves.
Mm.
And when you begin to lie to yourself, you begin to lie to everybody until now you're just covering up lies. And then that's when ministry becomes miserable. Like, man, there's so many things I want to say, but I can't disclose that. I can't say that when everybody else can. But now we've
Yeah,
created
right.
this. But now we've created
Everybody
this
can, but
culture
you
where
can't.
no one can come to church and no one can be honest about how they are. It's like, hey, how's your day going? Oh, God is so good. I am blessed. I got a sale on Cheerios this week, right?
I
No,
got a great parking spot.
yeah, I took the
God really
pastor's
can.
parking spot because it's reserved.
Yeah. Not at
That's
our church.
that. That's
There's
the
no pastor's
struggle. I
parking.
mean, that's the reason we started this podcast and this whole authentic pastor course and everything else that we're doing is to give some freedom, to give some permission. Does it come with a cost? Yeah, you got to consider the cost of what you're going to say, but I would rather be honest and open and authentic and tell you what's really going on in my life than to live with the weight of not telling you.
Well, yeah, because I mean, how many fake smiles have you had to put up every single Sunday morning? Now you can't unload on everybody who asks you that morning what's going on. You'd be stuck in the lobby. We'd never get to the pulpit. But that whole like, yeah, hey, yeah, good, doing good. Yeah, great, great. Life's fine.
Well, I think it goes back to when I said my wife gets up, she puts on her teacher hat, she goes to school. I mean, I do put on my smile, I put on my hat even when I'm in a bad day. You know why? That's my job. It
Right.
is my job.
Yeah, it's your job.
And I don't need to unload on everybody as they walk through the vestibule to come into the sanctuary on a Sunday morning. That's, my job is to care for you, love you, but I've got to have those places. It might not be on a weekend event, but there's got to be a place, like in our relationship, whether that be hundreds of miles away or just a couple miles away. You've got to have those people in your life. If not, you're going to carry that. And I'm afraid that even in, oh man, how many pastors' gatherings have I been to where you can just smell the shit in the air? It just wafts, right? I mean,
Lots.
going back to your perfect illustration to, start wrapping up. The last place it should smell like shit is a pastor's gathering, a
Yeah,
network
absolutely.
meeting, a denominational, whatever it might be, where pastors can come together and just go, here's what's really going on, as opposed to comparing notes, coveting somebody else's ministry, and pretending I've got it all together when I don't. And if nothing else, maybe this podcast is a place they can listen to the privacy of their pastor's study and confess, like, that's where I'm at. That's a good place to
Yeah.
start, is confessing where
It's a
you're
good,
at.
it's a really good place to start. It's a really good place. Pastors' gatherings for me are nothing but a place where you can show off and build your own pride and make other people feel bad about themselves. Um, that's my experience.
Well, that's mostly my experience, which is why
Yeah.
we started meeting, right? That's why 10
Right.
years ago,
Yeah.
20 of us started meeting in Colorado together and created that space where that's just not allowed,
No,
you
you
know?
can't do it. You can't showboat. You can't brag about things. You can talk about what's going on, but you got to talk about it and deal with it plainly, not in the sense
Mhm.
of, wow, look what God's got me doing. And only if you were more faithful or more skilled or learned this thing, you could do it too.
Yeah, and no fear of
It's tough. Sell the
ramifications is the
books.
culture that we've built. And so, I mean, in these podcasts, pastors who are listening have to make their own takeaways. There's no 3
Sure.
points, and therefore, here's the 6 things you need to do.
Yeah. I think it is really important. I just think it's really yeah, kind of going back to this idea of it's not the language you use per se, but it's being able to speak about something plainly and with truth, without fear of it coming back to get you. That for me is foundational. And I think a lot of Christians, a lot of pastors, they use the idea of love and grace as a cop out for being for really speaking what is truthful and really loving, right? Well, I love this person. I want to have grace. I don't want to hurt their feelings, but the reality is like, no, I mean, when Jesus dealt with the woman at the well, he called out her sin and he just dealt with it plainly. He said, this is true. Here's what it is. And here's who I am. Now go and sin no more. Right. I mean, like, and what did she do? She was amazed. She went and told everybody, come listen to this man who told me everything about myself. I think that is a perfect illustration how Jesus wants us to interact with people. Just know when you really understand what's going on in their life, you call it what it is, whether it's good or bad, right? If it's good, you celebrate with them. If it's bad, you call it out in their life and you say, "This is what's going on. Here's what you really need to be doing in light of who the Lord is, and here's how you get there." There's all kinds of ways to get there, probably, but uh, journeying with people in that space in a transparent and honest manner, I think would save the church and save pastors so much frustration and loneliness and isolation because you wouldn't be putting up the front of love and grace, which is like the kind, weak love and grace that most of us embrace in North America. And you actually drop it down to the idea of, authentic truth spoken in love out of a deep compassion for someone's soul and well-being. That changes the course of a relationship, changes the way you interact with people.
I love that you bring up that text, because that authentic conversation was a one-on-one conversation. The disciples weren't around. He didn't call out
Right.
someone's sin, in the midst of a crowd, but he opened the door through being open and honest, and allowing her to be open and honest in a way that she felt like she could go back and say, because that everyone in town knew who she was, how many husbands
Sure.
that she's had in the whole deal, and they
That
talked
story's
behind
been
her
around.
back. And so, but she was able to go back and go, "Yeah, listen, you all know who I am and what I've done, and I'm gonna have no problem telling you. So come see this person who will let me be myself without shame and guilt." Authenticity opens a door for other people, and that's my greatest passion for this project, is if I can help pastors in some small way learn a greater level of authenticity, then as pastors, we can lead people to a greater level of authenticity in their faith, and hopefully, by God's grace, create some transformation that is needed in the church and needed in the Christian community.
Yeah,
But it's
absolutely.
got to start. It's got to start with the pastor. So going
Well,
back to
yeah,
what we
because the
said
pastor's
earlier,
the under shepherd, right? Pastor's leading the flock, and people aren't going to model that or become like that if he's not setting the standard for how that works.
it's like we said
Now I
earlier.
sa- now now I feel
We
like a hypocrite. The hypocrisy in this podcast is unbelievable sometimes, isn't
We'll have to cut out half of that. So that's why we said we don't throw rocks at the church. We lift up pastors. And if we can do that for one another, then maybe pastors can do that and have that greater sense of confidence, self image, self esteem, where it erodes um, the imposter syndrome and give people the freedom to do that as well. So the church can be the most authentic place in
it?
America or beyond on a Sunday morning. That's the goal.
That is the goal. And maybe you have other episodes that are going to address this more, but I think it's also fair to say in this space, and maybe I want to say it, you can cut it if you want, but there's something about being authentic in your pain, but you also have to be authentic in your passion and in your gifting and in your accomplishments. And I want to make sure that pastors don't feel like that this whole thing is just about being transparent with how I'm feeling today, and that feeling's negative, and therefore people need to
Mm,
experience the negative side of me as well. Now, I want to be able to tell people, like, hey, I did this thing, it was really good, it was great, and I'd love
yeah.
for you to know about it. And
Yeah.
that's a good thing. It's the way God's wired me, and how's God wired you? Let's bring that out in you too. The positive side of authenticity is as important as the broken side of authenticity.
I wonder if it's actually more important.
Yeah, it's a good episode to explore with somebody more qualified on the subject, I'm sure.
Well, that would require a different host as well. So
Yeah.
how's that for the authentic
Yeah, right.
pastor
Yeah,
podcast host?
it's gonna be somebody that's not me.
I sit here just as much and try to absorb from these conversations, and that's why we don't have a script. We don't steer them. We'll see where it goes, and we don't cut anything. We don't bleep anything out, and because we just trust that it's going to hit somebody. Dan, man, it's a long time till I get to sit face to face with you and smoke a cigar in May,
Yeah,
but I can't wait for that. Thanks for taking the
it
time
is 6
today.
months, half a year still. That's too long, man.
It's about exactly
Yeah, half a
6 months
year.
until we have that gathering. So,
Yep.
listen, if I can find my way to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I might. I doubt that's going to happen, but thanks for taking an hour with me today. I really
Well, thanks
appreciate
for
you.
having me. I really appreciate coming on, and Lord willing, we'll find a way forward that increases the beauty of the church in America, you know?
Yeah, well, we'll do our part and trust God for the rest of it. Thanks, brother.
Amen. Yep. See you, Tim.